Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continual improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the ISology Hub. The ISology Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The ISology Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless actually, then we'd love you to come and join us. Just head over to the isologyhub.com.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the ISO Show. I'm Ian Battersby, a Senior Consultant with Blackmores UK Limited. This is our latest episode in a long-running series of episodes. Today I want to talk about gap analysis. What's it all about? It's something we talk about quite regularly on the ISO Show. We've discussed it many times. We've never gone into depth at all, really, on what gap analysis is and what it means to people. Well, what's it about? How do you conduct one? What does it give you? That sort of thing. So I'm going to just talk through today the background to it. What does it mean? It's worth us taking a bit of time to consider this. For us, it's the start of the whole process. When we engage a client, often that client has not been certified to any standards or to a particular standard that they're looking at that time. And the gap analysis is the beginning. It's the beginning of that journey, as we call it. It's the key, I think, to understanding where an organisation is right now and then establishing what it needs to do on its journey toward certification. But it's not just for certification. Remember, certification isn't always what people are trying to achieve. They may wish to just align themselves with a standard to ensure that they're doing the right thing. Standards were developed, the management system standards were developed for that very reason. And not everyone requires certification. But a gap analysis can be really useful even if you're not trying to achieve certification. So it's important to bear that in mind. A gap analysis works just as well for those people as it does for the people who are looking towards a certificate. So what is it? Well, what's the aim of a gap analysis? Well, the objective really is to carry out a review of your organisation against the specific requirements of whichever standard you're looking at. Very straightforward, really. It will help in establishing certain things. Firstly, areas where you conform to that standard, where you may already have established the required processes, procedures, the roles and responsibilities, the systems, the methods, the documentation, which would be required to conform to that standard. But also, importantly, it's looking at areas of non-conformity, where those things just don't exist at present and will need to be developed. It also will look at areas where you may partly conform. So it's important to understand those as well. You may currently have a basis for development, but it may not be fully rounded. It may not be fully implemented and embedded in your organisation. So it looks at those as well. From that understanding, the basic understanding against the requirements, we can then build key actions with timescales and responsibilities to help to achieve conformity. Making those actions concrete is important. If you don't have something which is required, what are you going to do about it? Who will do it? When will they do it? What resources are required? What money may need to be spent? Is it achievable in the timescale you want? This is also really useful to the leadership, the top management in an organisation. It helps to clarify for them what's needed, to look at the priorities, to resource what's required. I just mentioned resourcing the actions, and to establish a timeline to your end goal. So if you are looking to achieve something by a certain period of time, the gap analysis will show you what's required in that time, and it will allow the leadership to be able to contribute the right resource in order to help you to that. So what's the process? How do you conduct a gap analysis? What's important? Well, what is important is to do it in a very structured manner. It's also important to get access to existing documentation and to personnel in key roles. They'll be really helpful during the gap analysis in providing understanding. And what we want at this point is an understanding of how an organisation operates to see where it meets requirements. So planning of those aspects is essential from the very outset. It will be difficult to be partway through the process and discover you don't have the right people or documents in order to answer the questions. Now, this understanding at this point, it can be a tricky process if you're new to standards, as many people are at the gap analysis stage. At this point, doing it on your own can be quite difficult because of the language of standards, the structure. The way the frames, not everybody gets the language of standards. They say certain things which might mean quite a lot to people who are experts in this area, but to normal run-of-the-mill people, in every sector, in every walk of life, they don't necessarily mean very much, some of the words. So it can be quite difficult. So to steer our structured approach, let's remind ourselves of how all management system standards, look. This will give us a clue as to who we need and what we need to consider during the gap analysis. Now, as you may know, or if you're new to this, may not know, there are 10 clauses to each management system standard. 7 of those are really meaningful. They are clauses 4 to 10. And if we consider the meaning of these 7 meaningful clauses, we can work on who and what we need at this point. So clause 4 is what we call context. It's understanding in the world in which you operate, the environment in which you work, the people, the organisations which are important to you. It's about determining the scope of your system, what to include, what parts of the standard are relevant to you, which standards in particular might be relevant to you. And it's about what your system looks like and what processes are included within it, or what processes should be included within it. Clause 5 is about leadership. I talk constantly about leadership. And without leadership, systems fail. The standards recognise this fundamentally, which is why after context it's the first thing. It's about top management's commitment, how involved they are, their accountability, their commitment to resourcing, to promoting, to giving people authority through clear roles and responsibilities. It's about their endorsement of a policy. Policy is important, it's not just words. Policy is the overall intention and direction of an organisation expressed by its senior management. Policy exists to govern the behaviour of the organisation and its employees, its workforce, everybody within it, in order that they all work in the right direction to provide the best outcome. Whether that outcome is in terms of quality, whether it's in terms of health and safety, whether it's in terms of information security, it's defined by that policy, and that is important. Clause 6 is planning. Firstly, it's about assessing the risks and opportunities to your organisation and to your management system, understanding the uncertainty caused by your operating environment, that context I just mentioned. So there is a cross-reference between context and risk. It also involves setting of objectives. What would you like to change? What would you like to achieve? And then establishing some meaningful plans at that point to address the risks and the opportunities and the objectives, to create mitigation, to establish controls, to develop operational processes which will make you do the right thing in terms of addressing those risks and achieving your objectives. Clause 7 is about support, and by that it covers people and their competence. It covers the infrastructure in which you work, the environment. Are your facilities and equipment appropriate to what you need to do? It asks, have you identified what you need to monitor and measure to demonstrate that you're effective? It also covers awareness and communication. How do you make people aware of the system, policy, your processes, the processes they need to be effective in their roles? And it also talks about how you communicate with other relevant interested parties. What do you say to them about your management systems? And then it also covers documented information. How do you control the documentation which supports your system? Clause 8 is operation. It's the doing. It's the delivering of the product or service to the customer or client. This includes all the processes, procedures, protocols, guidance, instruction, forms for doing that. In ISO 9001, Clause 8 is about defining what's required for the customer, designing it, developing it, controlling externally provided products and services. Control anything which goes wrong, i.e. the concept of non-conformity is raised here. And it's about providing to the customer what they want and ensuring it meets their requirements. Clause 9 is about performance evaluation. So I've talked a moment ago about monitoring and measuring, but this is about the actual results of that, how they're evaluated, where they're reported. Importantly, in ISO 9001, it's also about what the customer thinks of you. It also covers things like internal audit and management review, if you've reached that stage of maturity in your system. And then Clause 10 is about improvement, the crux of all management system standards in a way. So what do you do about things which don't turn out as you expect? Again, that concept of non-conformity, their investigation, their causes. And again, talking about 9001, the inclusion of complaints and customer feedback in that. But in other standards, accidents, incidents, legal non-compliance, how do you improve on matters which are raised through those systems? And where do you seek other opportunities to improve or to innovate? So that's a quick resume of the clauses in the standards. All standards follow the same format, all management system standards anyway, follow that format. Annex SL, it's called, the high-level structure. That's what they look like. So that's what we're comparing against. Those 7 elements, those 7 clauses, which describe what a standard's all about. So considering all of that, who should we involve in your gap analysis? Remember, not everyone needs to be involved throughout. You don't have to have people sitting there for 8 hours not talking because it's not their bit. So just think about focusing people's time on what's important to them and what they hold responsibility for. But remember this as well, that the people who attend don't necessarily have to be the ones who are directly responsible for a process or a method or a system. But they must have some working understanding of how that works in order to be able to bring that understanding into the analysis. Now, of the people we want to include, firstly, I would want whoever is responsible for coordinating the management system. Its day-to-day running, its upkeep, its maintenance, its improvement, and the control of the documentation which underpins that management system. Now, at first, that person or those persons may not be fully known understood, assigned a responsibility within that organisation. And the gap analysis is there to try and establish that. It may be from the gap analysis that you begin to assign roles and responsibilities. Also at this point, I've talked about leadership being central to the success of a management system. So it will be useful to have somebody in a senior role, somebody who's responsible for resourcing the system, for communicating its importance to the workforce and to others, like external parties. Somebody who's responsible for setting the strategic direction of the organisation and for establishing the objectives to move that organisation forward. And also people who understand the context of the organisation. I've mentioned that already. The environment in which you operate. So understanding the interested parties, so the stakeholders as I've described them before, the needs of customers and others potentially, regulatory environment in which you operate, the customer environment, the sector, those sorts of things. The things which dictate what's important to you as a business. But then we need to look at those who are involved in risk management, whether that's operational risk, financial, commercial, regulatory risk, safety, environmental, and the people who oversee the methodology for assessing risk within the organisation. And also, it will be useful to have somebody with knowledge of the legal requirements which affect you, which are applicable to you as an organisation. And also to show how you evaluate yourself against the legal requirements. Okay? Now, those legal requirements may be specific to a standard, such as health and safety, environment, energy, whatever that might be. But if you go back to 9001, as I've touched on already, that standard says that you must ensure, and I quote, customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements are determined, understood, and consistently met. So even if you're looking at quality management or a business management system, which has 9001 at its heart, you have to understand your applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. You have to demonstrate that you meet those, because not meeting those doesn't help your customer. So, beyond legal requirements then, we want to have included anybody who is responsible for setting objectives which are related to the specific standard. So if you're establishing health and safety objectives or energy objectives or information security objectives, whatever it might be, if they are being set, we need an understanding of that bringing to the gap analysis. And all standards discuss competence. So we need somebody with a knowledge of competence arrangements to be included. And that isn't just competence of the individuals responsible for coordinating the management system, but it's across the board for delivering operational processes, maybe for developing and implementing safe practices, for the supervision of people, for legal compliance. It's many things, okay? So what are your broad competence arrangements? And also, if you look at 9001, which talks about the infrastructure and environment in which you operate, if you look at 45,001, which talks about safe operation of equipment, if you look at 14,001, which talks about environmental improvements and the need to maintain equipment correctly in order to have them working optimally, you need to look at facilities and equipment. Okay, the maintenance, the service, the test and inspection of equipment. The PPM schedule, so who's responsible for that? And that they are, as I said, more relevant to some standards than they are to others. So important to look at the standards to see which parts of facilities and equipment may be important to you. And we want the people who are responsible for developing and delivering operational processes involved, okay? The doing. Those who are defining customer requirements, possibly through the sales, tendering, estimating processes, for design and development of products and services, for the creation of the product or service, or the operations side of things, through manufacturing, assembly, or in another context, a software development if you're working in a tech world, for the delivery and the handover to the customer, the control of anything which is externally provided. So through the supply chain, through procurement, through receipt, through approval, through vendor approval. And then also we may want to include people who have knowledge of how things are monitored and measured, possibly operations people, but maybe people who are involved in data analysis, those who report performance to management, those in governance roles or on committees where there is oversight of performance and of effectiveness, and oversight of things which may go wrong. If you've already reached the stage of internal audit and management review, bringing the people responsible for that into the gap analysis would be useful. And then we've talked about the concept of non-conformity. So who's responsible? Who controls non-conformity? And who runs the improvement processes? Now, if you look at all of that, that can be quite a range of people. And it's impossible to say who shouldn't be from all of that included. What you don't want to do is run away with it and have too many people involved. But in smaller organisations, it may be that it's quite a limited number of people. People may wear many hats. People may not even have been assigned to some of those roles, as I mentioned. You may have not have decided who will be responsible for things like audit or non-conformity or monitoring and measuring. But that may in fact be the gap. And that's not a problem. That's what the gap analysis exists to discover. And it exists in order to plan, in order to fill those gaps and assign those roles and responsibilities. So that's the people who may be involved. What will we look at? So the documents, or in many cases the systems, because many things are not single documents anymore. Many things are system driven. We do online things, we have workflows. We have systems that don't require any further document because the content of the system itself drives the need. So be mindful that we don't necessarily need always a written down document or a document stored on SharePoint or a network or whatever it might be. However, of the things that might need to be documented, the first thing I would want to see is something which describes overall how the management system works, what it covers, how the organisation operates, the overview of its process is like. This may be in a management systems manual, it could be in a systems scope, a scoping document, whatever you want to call it, but something which gives me an overall view of how it all hangs together. Not just me, how you describe to other people, whether that's customers or your workforce or your supply chain, how you operate. At this point, an organisation chart helps as well. Who does what within the organisation? What are the roles and responsibilities and the reporting lines? Within that, and this doesn't always exist, a chart of the committee structure, the governance structure within an organisation can be very useful, showing what issues are reported in which directions and who's involved in doing that, and how overall the organisation from top down looks at how it operates and how it's effective. Also, these things, I think, become tarnished in some ways by their use by certain groups. But things like an overview of the mission, the vision, the values and the culture of the organisation are important, but only if they are lived values, only if they are things which drive how the business operates. Then, documents which describe context. I mentioned that earlier. Clause 4, the environment in which you operate. Traditionally, this is done by us and by many through a SWOT and PESTLE, but also at that point you need to identify your interested parties and their needs and expectations. So we would expect to see that sort of document at this point. A policy relevant to the standard you're working on is also something we would want to look at. Job descriptions could be quite useful. I talked about an organisation chart earlier, but what do people within that chart do? What governs their activity? How do you measure them? We would like to see something like a risk and opportunities assessment or analysis, and the methodology which underpins that. Objectives, written down, measurable objectives. And then look at a register of legislation, compliance obligations as it's called in 14,001, and some evidence of the methods of evaluation against the applicable requirements. Then competence arrangements, training records if necessary. This may not be a document, it may be an online system, which it tends to be these days. There may be something like a competence matrix in a spreadsheet. Any of these things which help us to understand how you measure the competence of individuals and specific roles. And then at this point, looking at management system awareness and training and how you judge whether people understand the policy and the arrangements which are in place. Then details of how you control documents, version numbering, hosting of documents, authorization, publishing, all of these things. And then moving on to monitoring and measuring. What processes have you in place for monitoring and measuring your activities? Whether that's operational processes or other things. Do you have KPIs? Do you have SLAs with customers that dictate how you should do things? Do you have internal performance metrics? In terms of your use of energy and environmental things, where do you draw your information on electricity usage, your gas usage, your water usage? If you have arrangements in place for health and safety, how do you measure that those arrangements are put in place correctly and followed? Through either local inspection, through the sign-off of safe working practices and risk assessments and method statements, through the competence arrangements of individuals. How do you measure the competence of individuals? And then if you've moved on to this point, what's your internal audit program? And where are your audit reports? Where are your management review records? But also beyond that, where's the agenda and minutes for regular meetings which include oversights of your performance? On all standards, where's the detail on non-conformity of either audit or process? This may cover incidents and accidents in ISOs 14 and 45,001. And where are your records of corrective action? And then we would like to see customer feedback, including complaints. For some standards, we want to see your emergency plans and how they are trained and monitored through drills. And then we get on to the operation side of things, so process documentation. The documents here have got to be appropriate to your business and to the needs of your business. They can be guidance, they can be instruction. They could be, as I've said, systems driven within software and IT systems. They could be forms, Word, Excel. They could be guidance through a PowerPoint presentation. If you look at 9001, it doesn't mandate written procedures, but evidence of being able to consistently and repeatedly deliver the outputs that you require and those things which the customer requires. So examples here could be change control documentation, sales, tendering, order processing documentation, procedures for the design and development of products and services, the design development records which state inputs, verification, validation of design activities, the outputs, again the approval of change within a design. And this could also cover the procedures to approve products and services for their release to the customer, the delivery and handover to the customer. We also may wish to see supplier third-party evaluation, onboarding of suppliers, verification that supplier delivery is as we wish through a goods in process, that sort of thing, or through other checking and monitoring of receipt. And then the non-conformity process, that may fall out of all of those, and also things like traceability of the product. So depending on standards, which ones you're going for, there could be limitless other documentation which might be appropriate. But this is just a sort of generic list of things which would be useful in all standards. So it's quite straightforward at this point. Once you've got the correct people and documentation assembled, we walk through every clause and every subclause of the standard. In our case, we have a spreadsheet which literally has the words of the standard copied into it. We talk, we look, we compare. We explain what the standard means, and we try to imagine what looks good in response to that standard. And what looks good varies depending on your type of organisation, the sector in which you work, your size, your scale, your risk. So it is about teasing out what you may currently have and really examining whether that meets the requirements of the standard. It might partially do so, so it might be a good basis for development. It may not do so at all, you may not have it at all. But what's important is planning at this point. So we go through every line of the standard. We talk to the right people and we look at the documentation and systems which are in place. And by breaking it down into those manageable words and sentences and phrases and clauses, we arrive at an overview where we've said, yes, you meet it, no, you don't, or you're somewhere in between. And we apply a simple scoring process on that, which is very arbitrary and could be argued with all you wish. We could make it more complex and give a scale of how partial you are. But at the end of the day, that's not the important thing. What's important is planning to fill those gaps that we've defined. And what we have to remember here is that this is not an audit. The evidence required may well be much less than in an audit, and the evidence won't be written down in the gap analysis in the way it would be in an audit report. Some things can be taken on trust at face value. There's no point in lying at this point. We're not demonstrating anything to a certification body right now. You're not being judged. But some documents may need to be looked at in a bit more detail to see that their content is appropriate. For instance, you may say, yes, we have a quality policy, or yes, we have a health and safety policy, but if it doesn't have the words in it that the standard requires, it may need work. You may say, oh yes, we can demonstrate leadership, but can you demonstrate leadership in terms of the accountability for effectiveness, in terms of the application of resource, in terms of the personal contribution of top management to promoting and raising awareness? You may say, oh yes, we've done audit, but is that audit by competent personnel? Does it cover all of the standard you're talking about, as well as the operational controls? Okay, so we will have to look in some detail, but we won't write into the gap analysis itself, chapter and verse, on what's been found as evidence against the requirements of the standard. Now, most organisations at this point lack significant parts of any standard. But certainly if you're coming to this fresh, certainly if you're a smaller organisation, these bits cannot, in many cases, be demonstrated. That's not something to worry about. Certain elements that we often call the management system or core elements, such as context, policy objectives, awareness and communications, monitoring, audit, management review, they're often not in place already. What often is in place is the operational side of things, which is quite effective, but not be planned in the manner the standards require, or being monitored for their effectiveness and improved in the manner that the standards require. So that's important to remember. A gap analysis will throw up things which you don't have. That's exactly what it's for. But it's all about how you plan to fill those gaps. And remember, right at the beginning, I said, you need concrete actions to fill those gaps. Who will do what by when and with what resource? This is where leadership comes into its own again. They will be required to help to resource that. So don't worry. If you find lots of gaps in your gap analysis, that's traditionally what happens. It's not about judging. It's not about certification yet. It's about finding the plan for being better. Now, on top of all of that, you may be going for multiple standards. 2, 3, 4. People will go for 9, 14, 45, quite often in one go. There are common areas of the standards which in gap analysis you can look at. Context, risk, objectives, audit, management review. So these can be considered as one across every standard. And the more you bring those together, the more integrated you will be. The less effort you will have, the easier the system will be to develop, the better control over documentation you will have, and the more understanding you'll get among the users of your systems. So remember that from the very beginning, integration of gap analysis will help with integration of your management system. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview as to what we would expect gap analysis to look like, who should be involved, what you should be looking at, and what your outcomes should be. It seems to have been quite a lot. I thought that gap analysis was a very short podcast, but when looking at it, I understand now that people have a fear at this point of going into gap analysis because of their lack of understanding. So hopefully we've given you a little bit of understanding as to what you need to consider, and also an understanding of how we might be able to come forward with a structured approach to help you with that. So that's it for today. Hopefully that's helped people to get their heads around about the first steps in the journey on certification. But before I go, I'd like to remind everybody to subscribe to the ISO show if you can on your preferred media player, if you've not already done so, that is. And if you've got any time to spare, just a few minutes it'll take you, please give us a review. 5 stars would be lovely. The review process helps us to reach a wider audience, so it's useful to us and others. As always, if you have any questions, please get in touch. Or if you've got any suggestions, we want to hear from people to find out what's interesting to you and what we should cover in the future. So send us an email, comment in your media player or whichever platform you're listening on. We'd love to hear from you. So that's all from me today. Thank you again for listening, and I'll catch up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.